Have you ever heard of the proverb, "The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth"? The story I will present to you today is pretty much the embodiment of this saying, in which a young man killed 30 of his fellow villagers in the span of just a few hours. Until very recently, this was the worst incident in modern Japanese history in terms of how many people were killed by an individual, and remains a harrowing story on how discrimination can lead to the destruction of an entire village. This is the story of the Tsuyama Incident. Toi Mutsuo was born in 1917 as the second child of a wealthy family. His family had historically been the prominent landlord of his town of birth, and Mutsuo was said to have a privileged upbringing thanks to this background. However, his grandfather would pass away not long after he was born, followed by his father and mother when Mutsuo was only 2 years of age. All 3 of them had passed away to tuberculosis, and because the disease was not well understood at the time, people who had tuberculosis, and to an extension the family members of those people, were considered to be cursed. As his grandfather and his father, who was the oldest son, had passed away, the family estate was supposed to be inherited by Mutsuo. But because he was only 2 years old at the time, the estate was muscled away from him by his uncle. And to make sure Mutsuo wouldn't try to reclaim the family's fortune in the future, the uncle forced Mutsuo's family to move out of town, with the justification being that his family was cursed and would bring further misfortune if allowed to stay. As a result, Mutsuo's grandmother took him and his older sister and moved to her birthplace, which resides in modern-day Tsuyama of the Okayama prefecture. She would purchase a plot of land there and make ends meet through farming. Mutsuo was prone to illness from a young age, but performed extremely well in school. He was the best student in his class, and his teacher recommended he receive higher education, which was rare at the time. But his grandmother refused, as she desperately needed another working hand for the farm. However, during his teenage years, Mutsuo was diagnosed with pleurisy, a type of inflammation of the lungs, and would not be able to participate in physical labor under the doctor's orders. Eventually, his older sister moved out when she got married, leaving a teenage Mutsuo alone in the house with nothing to do. It was around this time Mutsuo would begin to engage in what was known as yobai, which is when a man goes to a woman's house and has a relationship with her. This may sound strange by today's standards, but it was a custom that still existed in rural parts of Japan in the early 20th century. Mutsuo was a young man, somewhat famous for being extremely smart and doing well in school, so women of the village would often accept his advances, with some rumors saying he had relationships with more than 10 of the village's women, ranging in age from their late teens to 50 years old. But things would change when Mutsuo was 20 years of age. In 1937, he would be drafted into the army, but was deemed unfit for service in the prior physical exam. He was diagnosed with tuberculosis, the illness that had taken his parents and grandfather. Although Mutsuo's condition was still in its early stages, and could be treated even with the medical techniques of the time, the rumor that he had the cursed disease spread like wildfire throughout the village. Women who had previously embraced his advances would want nothing to do with him anymore. And it wasn't only the women, people of the village in general would begin to avoid him. This was a day and age when serving your country was a critical component of a man's identity. So the fact that Mutsuo was marked unfit for service, combined with the fact that women who were once happy to be with him now gave him the cold shoulder, had a significant impact on his self-confidence and sense of self-worth. There was a woman named Yuriko who he was particularly close with, even considering marrying. But when word got out of Mutsuo's illness, Yuriko left him to marry another man of the same village. Driven mad with jealousy, Mutsuo tried everything he could to win her back. He would repeatedly go to Yuriko's house uninvited, trying to rekindle their relationship. Surprisingly, his efforts would prevail, but not in the way Mutsuo had hoped. Tired of the constant harassment from Mutsuo, Yuriko left her husband and left the village altogether. She moved to a nearby town and got married to another man there before long. This would be the final straw for Mutsuo, being shunned from society for the majority of his life, he would begin forming a plan to metaphorically burn the village and extract his revenge. He made a list of people and households that had mistreated him, and drew up the most efficient route to take if he were to pay those households a visit in the future. He would then proceed to get his hands on a katana and a semi-automatic shotgun. He modified the shotgun to hold 9 rounds, and would practice with it in the woods almost every day. When he heard Yuriko would be coming back to visit the village in the near future, he decided to put his plan into action on that day. On May 20th, 1938, the day Yuriko was visiting, Mutsuo cut the power lines, causing a village-wide blackout. Because the electric grid at the time was unstable and blackouts were common, the people of the village didn't think much of it, and no one called the police or the electric company. Mutsuo dressed himself in a school uniform, maybe because it looked somewhat similar to the uniform soldiers would wear, and equipped himself with a katana, a couple daggers, and the modified shotgun. He also had the list of households that had mistreated him and would like to pay a visit to. Everything was set, and he would begin executing his plan a little past midnight. The first target would actually be his own grandmother, who he decapitated with an axe. He would give his reasoning for slaying his own grandmother in his will, which I will cover later on. Mutsuo would then move on to the house of a woman he previously had a relationship with, making quick work of her and her 2 children. He would proceed to 2 more houses, slaying 7 more villagers. The 4th house he visited was that of Yuriko, who was there when he arrived. Immediately realizing Mutsuo was here for herself, she jumps out a window, hoping that he would come after her and leave her family unharmed. Unfortunately, Mutsuo would make sure to quickly dispatch of her 5 family members, before pursuing Yuriko to the neighboring house she had run into. This house belonged to her grandfather. When Mutsuo arrived, Yuriko's grandfather was at the doorstep to block his entry, valiantly trying to protect his family and Yuriko. Yuriko's grandfather was not on Mutsuo's list of people that had mistreated him, but quite the contrary. He was one of the few people who had tried to help Mutsuo in securing a job and finding a wife even after word got out of his illness. But because this grandfather was standing in between Mutsuo and Yuriko, he had now become a target. The elderly man was gunned down, but bought enough time for his family to secure themselves inside the house. Mutsuo would furiously attempt to get into the house and reach Yuriko, randomly blasting rounds into the house and trying to break down the door. But he had spent too much time and caused too much noise, as he could see some other villagers making their way to the scene. Although he could not finish Yuriko, he weighed his options and decided to move on to the next house on the list. Mutsuo would attack a total of 11 houses, leaving 30 bodies in his wake, with 2 more injured. Most of the households he targeted were those of women he had previous relationships with, or their new boyfriends or husbands. The victims included people who were said to have begged for their lives, including young children, an indication of how merciless Mutsuo was in executing his plan. On the other hand, there was an elderly man he had spared, claiming, "You never spoke bad about me," leaving it unclear what exactly his criteria was on who gets to live and who doesn't. After he had exhausted his list, he would walk into the mountains and write a will. In this will, he would describe the suffering he went through, being outcast from society due to his illness, and that he wishes that in his next life he would be born into a healthier body and live a happy life. He also gives the reasoning on why he killed his grandmother first. It was so she would not have to deal with the social backlash that would inevitably come after her grandchild slayed half the village. He also describes how he regrets not being able to finish Yuriko, and how people like her husband should not exist in this world. Finally, the last sentence in his will wrote, "It's almost dawn. I will go now." Mutsuo's lifeless body was found the next morning. Because the culprit and most of the victims had passed away, and because so much time has passed, the finer details of this case have been lost to time. In 2008, a woman claiming to be Yuriko, who was now well into her 90s, would be interviewed by a tabloid. She would deny ever having any relationship with Mutsuo, and that his actions were the result of being rejected by the village as a whole. For a very long time, this incident would be known as the worst case of mass murder in modern Japanese history, until in 2019, a man set fire to an office of Kyoto Animation, killing 36 people, which I also have a video on. I'll leave a link in the description if you're interested. What do you think of the case? Is there any room to feel sorry for Mutsuo and the life he lived? Or was he simply a psychopathic killer who took out his frustrations on his fellow villagers? Let me know in the comments below. A big thank you to Korbachu and my other Patreons for supporting this channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. And as always, thank you for watching until the end. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. I'll see you next time.